Hi everybody, Yoav from Aspectos here, and today we are going to learn how to use OpenTelemetry to instrument RabbitMQ to create spans for different operations. We will then see how to visualize these spans and traces using Jaeger and Aspecto. Okay, so all of this code will be written in Node.js, all these code examples, and you can find a link to a GitHub repo where you can find these code examples right in the description below. Right, so let's jump straight to the code. We are now looking at the publisher code. As you can see, it's a very simple Express application. I've taken it directly from the Express website. It's their Hello World for the Getting Started guide. And what I've done here is I just added the functionality to send messages to RabbitMQ. Now, I defined the exchange name to be example. It's arbitrary. It can be any name, of course. And every time the get endpoint will be invoked, the message hello world will be sent to this exchange. Now that the exchange type is fanout, which means it supports publisher subscriber pattern. Every queue that will be bound to this exchange will receive a copy of the message. The consumer code is also quite simple. The only thing being done here is defining the exchange, the Rabbit connection, and creating a new queue for the consumer, binding this queue to the exchange. It's all pretty normal RabbitMQ stuff. And here we defined a callback so that every time a message will be received from the exchange, the consumer will just print out the message. So when the get endpoint of the producer will be invoked, the producer will then publish a message to the example exchange. The consumer, which listens to this exchange, will receive this message and print it out to the console. If any of the code examples we've used so far confuses you, go ahead and read the RabbitMQ documentation. I will share a link in the description of this video. Okay, now the next thing we want to do is to run our two services. But before we do that, we need to deploy an instance of RabbitMQ. We will use Docker for that and deploy a local instance. Okay, now let's check out the UI management and see that the instance is up and running. Right, so looking at the RabbitMQ management UI, I see that there are no connections, no sessions being created yet, and the exchange are only the default exchange that created with the instance. This is good. Now we can run our services. Let's start by running the publisher. We will use the service environment variable to give this service a name. The publisher is running. Let's now run the consumer. And the consumer is running. Let's invoke the get endpoint of the publisher using curl. Okay, we got the hello world response back from the endpoint. We can see that the publisher sent the message, and we can see that the consumer received the message. Awesome. We have two services that can communicate with each other. Now, the next thing we want to do is to add observability in the form of traces to the system. Now, we will create spans and generate traces by using OpenTelemetry and adding auto instrumentations for all the libraries that we just used. Okay, so go ahead and create your tracing file and require this library. It's the Node SDK for OpenTelemetry. We will need to initialize this Node SDK and then start it. Now let's look at the configuration. The first part is the span processor. We will use a simple span processor. There is a simple span processor and a batch span processor. We will not get into OpenTelemetry in depth in this video, but I will share links for great articles about OpenTelemetry and OpenTelemetry with Node in the description of this video. So we will use the console span exporter to print out the spans that we are generating to the console. The next step will be to visualize them. And let's look at the instrumentations. Now, the first instrumentation is for RabbitMQ. It's the instrumentation for the library, the AMQP lib that we're using to communicate with the RabbitMQ instance. The second instrumentation is the HTTP instrumentation and the Express instrumentation. Now, we need all of this instrumentation because let's follow the publisher and what he does. The publisher receives an HTTP request using Express application and then publishes a message using the AMQP protocol to RabbitMQ instance that runs locally. Okay, and the third is just naming the service. Right. So let's run the services using this tracing configuration. And to do that, remember that we need to require the tracing file before any other code in the system runs. So let's do that. Now I will require the code using the node command line. The publisher is now running. Let's add the requirement to the consumer as well. Right, the consumer is running. Let's invoke the endpoint. And we got the hello world response back. Looking at the publisher, oh, we see that the spans have been printed to the console. Let's see. Okay, we can see the span for sending a message to RabbitMQ. We can see the span for the get HTTP request. And we can see the span for the express endpoint that received the request. Great. Now looking at the consumer, we can see the span for receiving a message from RabbitMQ. This is great. Every service printed out exactly the operations that it did in the form of spans and in the format of OpenTelemetry. Now we will be visualizing these spans and see a full picture of the trace using first Jaeger, then Aspecto. So we will deploy a local instance of Jaeger on our machine. Just type in this command. Right. Okay. The Jaeger is now running. Let's open the user interface of Jaeger and see that there are no traces yet here. Okay. Now the next step is to change our tracing configuration. All we need to do is actually just change the exporter. Instead of printing out the spans to the console, we will send them to Jaeger. So let's import the exporter Jaeger library and use it as the new exporter. Right. Now let's run our services using the new tracing configuration. Publisher is running. Because we're using the publisher subscriber messaging pattern, we can actually run more than one consumers, and it will give us some interesting features in the UI, both in Aspecto and in Jaeger. So let's do that. Let's call the first service consumer1, and we will change the tracing configuration to send traces to Jaeger. And let's run another service. We will call him consumer2. Let's invoke the publisher. We got the hello world response from the endpoint. Publisher received the message. Consumer1 printed out the message. Consumer2 printed out the message. Nice. Let's look at the Jaeger UI. Let's refresh it. Okay, we can see that there are 4 services: the publisher, Jaeger query, consumer1, and consumer2. Clicking at the publisher and clicking Find Traces, we can see all of the spans we generated, 3 spans for the publisher, 1 span for the consumer, and 1 span for consumer 2. So we can see all the 5 spans we generated, and we can see that they grouped together to create a span, which is a group of, to create a trace, which is a group of spans that have some kind of relationship between them. Let's click at the trace and see more information. Okay, we can see that the first thing that happened is the HTTP GET request that we invoked using curl. And then the express got this request. Here we can see the get endpoint that we defined. Now we can see the publisher that sent the message to the example exchange in RabbitMQ, and both of the consumer that generated the span after receiving a message from RabbitMQ. Great. Now let's visualize it using Aspecto. In order to export our traces to Aspecto, we will just need to adjust the tracing configuration a little bit. Let's do that. Instead of the Jaeger exporter that we've used, we will change it to use another exporter. We will use the OTLP trace exporter taken for the exporter trace OTLP proto library. So go ahead and install this library and initialize a new trace exporter using the Aspecto URL and your own Aspecto API key. To get a new API key, just create a new account on Aspecto. It's a free account. You don't even need to put down a credit card. I share a link on how to do that in the description. Okay, put it in the exporter inside the simple span processor, and let's run the services again using the Aspecto configuration. Okay, all of our services are running, invoking the endpoint. Right. Let's see that everything works properly. Yeah. Now let's look at the Aspecto platform and see our traces. We can see a table of all the traces that we've sent to the platform in the last 5 minutes. We can see that the trace contrived from 5 spans. We can see the entry point, all of the services. Here we can see that the publisher sent 3 spans, consumer 1 sent 1 span, and consumer 2 sent 1 span. The duration of the entire trace, and when did it happen. Now, if I hover over this trace, we can see a graph that describes the relationship between all of these spans. This graph actually describes the flow of our application, starting from the HTTP request that we initiated using curl, receiving it in the publisher using express, and then sending a message to the topic example using the AMQP library. After that, the message was received by the exchange example in RabbitMQ instance and sent to the consumers that were listening on this exchange. Okay, this is it. I hope you learned a lot. I had a lot of fun. Thank you very much, and see you next time.